Hello, friend. Welcome back. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you settling in after a long day? Perhaps you're watching the darkness gather outside your window, grateful for the warmth and safety of your home. Hold that feeling for a moment, because tonight we're going to step into a world where darkness meant something entirely different, where safety was never guaranteed, and where the simple act of breathing the air around you could mean death. I want you to imagine a European city in the year 1656. Let's say it's Rome, though it could just as easily be London, Amsterdam, or Naples. The sun is setting, painting the narrow cobblestone streets in shades of amber and rust. But there's something wrong with this picture. The streets that should be bustling with merchants closing their shops, with children being called home for supper, with the ordinary chaos of urban life, these streets are nearly silent. A few figures move through the lengthening shadows, but they don't move like ordinary people. They walk with strange, deliberate steps, keeping close to the walls. Some carry bundles of herbs pressed to their faces. Others have tied cloth soaked in vinegar around their mouths and noses. And then, at the far end of the street, you see it, a figure that doesn't look quite human. Tall, impossibly tall, dressed entirely in black. Where its face should be, there's something else. Something with a long, curved beak like a monstrous bird. In one gloved hand, it carries a wooden cane. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't need to. Death itself is never in a rush. This is a plague doctor, and for centuries, this image has haunted our collective imagination. You've seen the pictures, perhaps at Halloween or in period dramas, that distinctive beaked mask, the long black coat, the wide-brimmed hat. It's become almost theatrical, hasn't it? A costume, a curiosity. But tonight, I want to strip away the romance and the mystery and show you what these figures truly were, what they truly did, and why their story is far stranger and more disturbing than any Halloween decoration could suggest. The Plague Doctor emerged during one of humanity's darkest chapters, a time when death moved through cities like a flood, when the very air seemed poisoned, when the foundations of society cracked and nearly shattered under the weight of incomprehensible loss. These weren't heroes from legend. They weren't miracle workers or saints. They were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, armed with medieval science that was often worse than useless, wearing protective equipment based on theories that were fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. But here's what makes their story so compelling, so necessary to understand. They went anyway. They walked into plague houses. They examined the dying. They recorded the dead. They did this knowing that they were likely walking toward their own deaths, armed with nothing but superstition, desperate hope, and a contract that promised payment if they somehow survived. Tonight we're going to explore who these men really were. Not the myth, not the Halloween costume, but the actual historical reality. We'll discover why they wore those bizarre costumes, what they actually believed about disease, and what they did in those plague-ridden houses. We'll meet some of them by name, hear their stories, and understand the medieval world that created them. And we'll confront some uncomfortable truths about medicine, authority, and what human beings are willing to do when faced with apocalyptic catastrophe. Because the harsh truth about plague doctors isn't just that their medicine was ineffective, though it was. It isn't just that their protective gear didn't work, though it didn't. The harsh truth is more complex, more human, and ultimately more revealing about both medieval society and our own. These men existed at the intersection of science and superstition, authority and desperation, courage and foolishness. They were neither heroes nor villains, but something more interesting. They were symptoms of their time, products of a worldview that was simultaneously sophisticated and catastrophically ignorant. So settle in, get comfortable. As the darkness gathers and you're safe in your own space, Let's walk together into a world where darkness meant something far more terrible. Let's meet the plague doctors, not as folklore, but as flesh and blood. Let's understand what they faced, what they believed, and what their existence tells us about human nature when confronted with the unthinkable. Now, let's begin. To understand the plague doctor, we must first understand the plague itself. And to understand the plague, we must step back to 1347, 3 centuries before our Roman doctor walked those emptied streets. This is where our story truly begins, in the Mediterranean ports where ships arrived carrying far more than silk and spices. Imagine the harbour at Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. 12 Genoese trading ships limp into port, returning from Caffa on the Black Sea. The sailors aboard are dying. Not dying in the ordinary way that sailors might die, not from wounds or storms or malnutrition. They're covered in strange black swellings the size of eggs or apples, concentrated in their groins, armpits and necks. They're burning with fever. They're coughing blood. Most horrifyingly, their skin has begun to blacken with subcutaneous hemorrhaging, turning them into living corpses before they die. The harbour authorities try to quarantine the ships, but it's already too late. The disease has come ashore. Within days, people in Messina begin developing the same symptoms. Within weeks, the disease is spreading through Sicily like wildfire. Within months, it will have reached mainland Italy. Within 3 years, it will have killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population. This is the Black Death, the great mortality, the pestilence that would reshape European civilization so profoundly that we still live with its consequences today. It's caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas that lived on black rats, though nobody in the 14th century knew this. They couldn't see bacteria. They didn't understand vectors or transmission. They didn't know about germs at all. What they did know was death, and they knew it on a scale that's almost impossible for us to comprehend. Medieval people were accustomed to death in ways we aren't. Infant mortality was high. Life expectancy was short. War, famine, and disease were constant companions. But this was different. This was death that moved with such speed and totality that it seemed to erase the normal rules of existence. In the medieval understanding of medicine, inherited primarily from ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, disease was caused by an imbalance in the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humours corresponded to 4 qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry, and health meant keeping them in proper proportion. This theory had dominated European medicine for over 1,000 years, and it would continue to do so for centuries more. But the plague challenged this understanding in fundamental ways. It killed too quickly, too universally, too indiscriminately. It struck the healthy and the sick, the young and the old, the rich and the poor. Traditional treatments, bloodletting, purging, balancing the humours, seemed useless. Physicians fled from plague cities just as quickly as everyone else, and often died just as readily when they stayed. There was another theory, though, that seemed to make more sense to medieval observers: miasma. The idea that disease was carried on bad air, corrupt vapours rising from swamps or rotting matter, or even from the alignment of the planets. When you stood in a plague city, this theory seemed self-evident. The smell alone, of mass graves poorly covered, of bodies decomposing in houses, of the general breakdown of sanitation, was overwhelming. Surely, medieval people reasoned, breathing this poisoned air was what caused the sickness. This belief in miasma would shape everything that came after, including the distinctive costume of the plague doctor. If disease travelled on corrupt air, then the solution was to filter or purify that air somehow. Sweet-smelling herbs and spices, strong perfumes, anything that might counteract the stench of death. These became the tools of protection. The logic made perfect sense within the medieval worldview, even though it was fundamentally incorrect. The first major outbreak of the Black Death lasted from 1347 to 1353, but the plague didn't disappear after that initial devastation. It became endemic, returning in waves for the next 4 centuries. Major outbreaks struck London in 1563, 1593, 1603, 1625, and most famously in 1665. Paris suffered in 1466, 1533, and 1580. Venice in 1506 and 1630. Amsterdam in 1624 and 1664. The list goes on and on. Each outbreak had its own character, its own peculiarities, but they shared common patterns. The disease would arrive suddenly, often traced to ships or travellers from infected regions. It would spread through the poorest, most crowded neighbourhoods, Italians first, where people lived in close quarters with inadequate sanitation. Then it would climb the social ladder, eventually affecting even the wealthy who thought their fine homes and country estates would protect them. Nothing protected against it. Not prayer, not medicine, not walls or wealth. Cities developed responses to these recurring outbreaks. They established quarantines, though they didn't always enforce them consistently. They created pest houses, hospitals specifically for plague victims, though going to one was essentially a death sentence. They hired guards to seal infected houses, sometimes trapping healthy family members inside with the dying. They dug mass graves, conducted door-to-door searches for the sick and dead, and attempted to regulate trade and movement in and out of the city. And they needed someone to go into those houses of death, to examine the sick, to declare whether someone truly had plague or some other disease, to count the dead and mark the houses. They needed someone to testify in court about whether a death was plague or natural causes, because inheritance and legal matters didn't stop during an epidemic. They needed someone to serve as the medical and legal authority in the midst of catastrophe. This is the role the plague doctor was created to fill, not a volunteer position, not a calling, but a job, a contract, a civic necessity born of desperate circumstances. The position of plague doctor emerged gradually through the 15th and 16th centuries, becoming formalized and standardized as outbreaks became more frequent and cities learned to anticipate them. These weren't the regular physicians, the respected doctors who treated wealthy patients in normal times. Those men fled. They had the means to leave, and they took it. The plague doctors were something else entirely, a specialized emergency position that cities would hire for when the pestilence arrived. They were often second-rate physicians, young doctors fresh from training, or even people with minimal medical knowledge who were willing to take the risk for the substantial pay. The role of the plague doctor crystallized most clearly in Italian cities during the 16th century, though similar positions emerged across Europe under different names and with varying responsibilities. To understand what they were, we need to understand both the medieval medical profession and the civic administration of plague response. In normal times, the medical profession was highly stratified. At the top were the university-trained physicians, men who had studied for years at places like Bologna, Padua, or Montpellier. These physicians were scholars first, learned in Latin and Greek, steeped in the classical medical texts. They rarely touched patients directly. They diagnosed through observation, asking questions about symptoms, examining urine samples, and casting horoscopes to determine the astrological influences on the patient's illness. They prescribed treatments, but the actual physical work of bloodletting, applying poultices, or preparing medicines was done by surgeons and apothecaries, professions that were considered more like craftsmen than learned professionals. Surgeons were trained through apprenticeship, not university. They cut hair, pulled teeth, set bones, and performed the bloody work of surgery without anesthesia beyond strong alcohol. Apothecaries prepared and sold medicines, often running shops that functioned as both pharmacies and grocery stores for exotic ingredients. Below these recognized professions existed a whole world of folk healers, midwives, cunning folk, and traveling medicine sellers, all of whom provided care to those who couldn't afford licensed practitioners. The plague disrupted this hierarchy entirely. When an outbreak began, the wealthy physicians left. They had properties in the countryside where they could wait out the pestilence. Their wealthy clients expected them to be available for consultation once everyone had relocated to their rural estates. This wasn't seen as cowardice exactly. It was prudent. Why stay in a plague city when you had the means to leave? But it created an enormous problem for civic authorities who needed medical professionals to manage the crisis. Cities began to hire plague doctors under specific contracts, often negotiated at the beginning of an outbreak. These contracts are fascinating historical documents because they reveal exactly what cities expected these men to do and what they were willing to pay for it. A typical contract from 17th century Italy might specify that the doctor must examine all suspected plague cases within the city and render a diagnosis. This required entering homes where the sick lay dying, approaching close enough to observe symptoms, and making a determination about whether the disease was truly plague or some other ailment. This distinction mattered enormously because a plague diagnosis meant the house would be sealed, the inhabitants quarantined, and all their possessions potentially burned. Testify in legal proceedings about cause of death, inheritance, business contracts, debts. All of these required legal resolution, and the cause of death was often central to these matters. Was the deceased killed by plague or by natural causes? The plague doctor's testimony carried legal weight. Visit pest houses regularly to tend to the sick. This meant spending time in hospitals filled with people in various stages of dying from one of the most infectious diseases in human history, attempting to provide care with the limited and largely useless tools of medieval medicine. Perform autopsies on plague victims when requested by authorities. This was perhaps the most dangerous task, involving direct contact with infected corpses, cutting open bodies to examine the characteristic buboes and internal damage caused by the disease. Keep records of all cases, deaths, and treatments. These records helped authorities track the spread of the disease, plan for burial needs, and make decisions about quarantine measures. In return, the plague doctor received substantial payment, often many times what a regular physician might earn in a year. They also received housing, food, and sometimes additional benefits like tax exemptions or grants of citizenship. If they survived the outbreak, they might receive a pension. It was dangerous work, but the compensation reflected the risk. Who accepted these positions? The evidence suggests several types of men. Some were young physicians fresh from training, hoping to make enough money to establish their own practices. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. If you survived a plague as a plague doctor, you'd have both capital and reputation. Others were older physicians who had failed to establish successful practices. Perhaps they lacked wealthy clients. Perhaps they had reputations as mediocre practitioners. The plague doctor position offered a way to earn significant income and potentially improve their standing. Others still were men with minimal formal training who simply needed the money. Some cities grew so desperate that they hired anyone willing to do the work, regardless of qualifications. One of the earliest documented plague doctors we know by name is Nostradamus. Yes, that Nostradamus, the one famous for prophecies. Before he became known for his cryptic predictions, Michel de Nostradam was a plague doctor in southern France during several outbreaks in the 1540s. His treatments were unusually progressive for his time. He emphasized cleanliness, fresh air, and rose-hip tea rich in vitamin C, which may have actually helped patients survive. He gained a reputation for having unusual success rates, though whether his treatments truly helped or he was simply fortunate in which patients he saw is impossible to know. The practical reality of the work was grim beyond measure. A plague doctor might be called to dozens of houses each day. He would enter through doors marked with red crosses or painted with pleas for mercy. Inside, he would find families in various stages of collapse. Perhaps a child was sick, but the parents were still healthy, pleading with him to save their daughter. Perhaps the entire household was infected, with bodies in some rooms and dying patients in others. Perhaps he would find a single survivor, uninfected but surrounded by the corpses of everyone they loved. He would examine the patients, looking for the telltale buboes, those swellings in the groin, armpit, and neck that were the signature of bubonic plague. He would note the fever, the delirium, the characteristic smell. He would make his diagnosis and give his recommendations, knowing that most of those recommendations were useless: bloodletting, purging, poultices of crushed herbs or animal fat, prayers. Almost nothing actually helped. Then he would move to the next house, and the next, and the next, day after day, week after week, month after month, until the outbreak finally burned itself out, or until he succumbed to the disease himself. Many did. The mortality rate among plague doctors was significant, despite their protective equipment and attempts at maintaining distance. By the early 17th century, the role of plague doctor had become institutionalized across European cities. What had begun as an ad hoc response to crisis had evolved into an established position with defined responsibilities, standardized equipment, and recognized authority. This consolidation coincided with the development of what we might call the classic plague doctor costume, the image that has survived in our cultural memory. The most iconic element, of course, is the beaked mask. To understand why this mask was developed, we need to understand the miasma theory in more detail. Medieval and early modern physicians believed that plague was caused by corrupt air, specifically air that had been poisoned by rotting matter, astrological influences, or divine punishment. The solution then was to filter or purify this air before breathing it. The beaked mask was designed by Charles de Lorme, chief physician to King Louis XIII of France in 1619. De Lorme wasn't a plague doctor himself. He was a court physician, exactly the kind of learned, wealthy practitioner who would normally flee a plague city. But he was tasked with designing protective equipment for physicians who needed to work in infected areas. And his design became the standard. The beak wasn't just decorative or intimidating, it served a specific function within the miasma theory. The long curved beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, dried roses, carnations, mint, myrrh, cinnamon, cloves, storax, laudanum, and sometimes camphor or ambergris. These strong-smelling substances were believed to purify the corrupt air before it entered the doctor's lungs. The longer the beak, the more space for aromatics, and the more filtering of the poisonous air. The glass eye openings allowed vision while preventing the corrupt air from entering through the eyes. The entire mask was sometimes coated with wax or oil to make it impermeable. The doctor would breathe in through the nostrils at the base of the beak, drawing air through the dried herbs, theoretically filtering out the poisonous miasma before it reached his lungs. The rest of the costume was equally purposeful. The long black overcoat was made of waxed leather or heavy canvas, treated to make it impermeable to the poisonous air. It covered the doctor from neck to ankle. Leather gloves extended well past the wrists, overlapping with the sleeves. Leather boots reached to mid-calf or higher. The wide-brimmed leather hat served multiple purposes. It marked the doctor's professional status, protected from rain, and was believed to help deflect corrupt air away from the body. The wooden cane served several practical functions. It allowed the doctor to examine patients without direct touch, lifting blankets, indicating where patients should position themselves, measuring pulse by having patients press their wrists against the cane. It could be used to keep desperate family members at a distance, and it served as a marker of authority, a visual symbol that this figure had official status and power. This authority was real and substantial. Plague doctors weren't just medical practitioners during an outbreak, they became agents of the state with significant legal powers. They could order houses sealed. They could mandate that families be separated, with the sick sent to pest houses. They could condemn entire neighborhoods to quarantine. Their diagnosis of plague had profound legal, social, and economic consequences for everyone involved. Consider what a plague diagnosis meant for a household. Once a plague doctor declared that a family member had plague, the house would be sealed. Guards would be posted to prevent anyone from leaving. Everyone inside, sick or healthy, would be trapped together until 40 days had passed or until everyone inside had died. Food would be passed through the windows by officials using long poles. The family's possessions might be burned or confiscated. Their business or shop would close. Their livelihood would vanish. This gave plague doctors enormous power, but it also made them figures of fear and resentment. Imagine watching that beaked figure approach your house. You know what their visit might mean. You know that their diagnosis could seal your fate. Even if you're not sick, their declaration could lock you in a house that will become your tomb. Is it any wonder that families sometimes hid their sick, tried to bribe officials, or attacked plague doctors in the street? The position attracted not just mediocre physicians, but also opportunists and outright charlatans. Some plague doctors took bribes to misdiagnose cases, declaring plague when there was none to settle grudges or business disputes, or declaring no plague when there clearly was in exchange for payment from wealthy families who wanted to avoid quarantine. Some stole from the houses of the dead, knowing that they had access where others feared to go. Some practiced extortion, demanding payment to avoid making a plague diagnosis. Cities tried to regulate these abuses through their contracts and through oversight, but during a major outbreak, authority structures often broke down. Who was going to supervise the plague doctor when everyone else was fleeing or dying? Who would testify against him when he had the power to seal your house? The very circumstances that made the position necessary also made abuse almost inevitable. Yet not all plague doctors were corrupt or incompetent. Some took their responsibilities seriously and worked tirelessly to help the sick, even knowing that their treatments were largely useless. They provided comfort, recorded last wishes, helped write wills, and bore witness to suffering that others refused to see. They maintained a medical and legal framework when society was fragmenting around them. Their presence, however inadequate their actual medicine, represented society's refusal to completely surrender to chaos. The consolidation of the plague doctor role also reflected a broader change in how European societies responded to epidemic disease. The medieval approach had been largely reactive and religious. Pray, do penance, accept God's will. By the 16th and 17th centuries, there was a growing belief that plague could be managed through rational administration, systematic observation, and enforced public health measures. Cities developed extensive bureaucracies to manage plague outbreaks. Health boards, staffed by civic officials rather than physicians, coordinated responses. They hired not just plague doctors, but also guards to enforce quarantines, cleaners to disinfect houses and remove corpses, administrators to manage pest houses, and clerks to keep detailed records of infections and deaths. The plague doctor was one component in this larger system, the the medical authority that gave legal legitimacy to actions that often violated traditional property rights and personal liberty. This system was built on a foundation of theory that was wrong: miasma theory, humoral medicine, astrological influences. But the administrative structures themselves, the idea that epidemic disease required systematic public health responses coordinated by civil authority, this represented a genuine innovation that would eventually contribute to effective disease control once the underlying science improved. If we can speak of a golden age of plague doctors, and that phrase feels grotesque given what it entails, it would be the period from roughly 1575 to 1665 when major plague outbreaks struck European cities with devastating regularity, and the plague doctor system was fully developed and institutionalized. During this century, the role achieved its most complete form, and we have the most detailed records of what these men actually did. Let's focus on a specific time and place to make this concrete: Venice during the plague of 1630 to 1631. This outbreak killed approximately 46,000 people in Venice itself, nearly a third of the city's population. The Republic of Venice had one of the most sophisticated plague response systems in Europe, developed over centuries of dealing with recurring outbreaks. Their health magistracy, the Provveditori alla Sanità, kept meticulous records that survive today, giving us remarkable detail about the plague doctors who worked during this catastrophe. Venice hired multiple plague doctors during the 1630 outbreak, each assigned to different districts of the city. They were supported by a vast apparatus of guards, cleaners, grave diggers, and administrators. The pay was extraordinary. One doctor, Giacomo Stelluti, was paid 500 ducats for 6 months of work, roughly equivalent to several years' salary for a skilled craftsman. He also received housing, food, wine, and exemption from certain taxes. What did a day in the life of a Venetian plague doctor look like? Our sources give us glimpses. The doctor would begin in the morning by visiting the pest houses, the hospitals specifically designated for plague victims. These were nightmarish places. Patients lay on straw pallets, dozens to a room, in various stages of dying. The smell was overwhelming: rotting flesh, excrement, blood, and the desperate attempts to cover these smells with perfumes and burning herbs. The noise was worse: moaning, crying, delirious ravings, prayers, screams. The plague doctor, in his full protective costume, would move from patient to patient. He would examine the buboes, those swellings that were the signature of bubonic plague. Sometimes these would rupture naturally, spilling pus and blood. When they didn't, the prevailing treatment was to lance them, cutting into the swelling to drain the infected material. This rarely helped and often hastened death by introducing additional infection. But it was standard practice based on humoral theory, the idea being that you needed to release the corrupt material from the body. Other treatments included bloodletting, purging with strong laxatives, induced vomiting, and the application of poultices made from bizarre ingredients. One recipe called for a mixture of crushed emeralds, unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, and pearls ground in rose water. Another involved plasters made from chopped snakes, pigeon meat, and human excrement. The theory behind these concoctions was complex, based on the doctrine of signatures, the belief that God designed cures to resemble the diseases they treated, and elaborate humoral calculations. None of them worked. After his rounds in the pest house, the doctor would make house calls throughout his assigned district. Citizens could summon him by reporting suspected cases to the health board, or he might conduct systematic searches, going door to door looking for hidden cases. Each visit followed a similar pattern: examination of symptoms, diagnosis, and the crucial decision about whether to order the house sealed. This decision had life or death consequences, not just for the sick person, but for everyone in the household. Once sealed, a house became a prison. The healthy were trapped with the dying, with predictable results. Yet if cases weren't isolated, the disease would spread even faster through the crowded city. The plague doctor stood at the center of this impossible calculus, making decisions that he knew would likely kill some people in the hope of saving others. The Venetian records also reveal the plague doctor's role in autopsy. When someone died at home with ambiguous symptoms, or when authorities needed to confirm that a death was definitely from plague rather than another cause, they would summon the plague doctor to perform a post-mortem examination. This meant cutting open the corpse, examining the internal organs, and making a determination based on the presence of characteristic swellings in the lymphatic system and other organs. This was perhaps the most dangerous work a plague doctor did. Plague bacteria remained viable in corpses for days. The pneumonic form of plague, which attacked the lungs and was spread through respiratory droplets, made any close contact with bodies exceptionally dangerous. Yet autopsies were performed, recorded, and used as evidence in legal proceedings about inheritance, insurance, and criminal cases. During this flourishing period, plague doctors also became more sophisticated in their record-keeping and their attempts to understand the disease. They began tracking patterns, which neighborhoods were affected first, how the disease spread through households, whether certain weather conditions seemed to worsen outbreaks. These observations didn't lead to correct theories about disease transmission. They lacked the conceptual framework to understand bacterial infection or flea vectors, but they represented genuine attempts at empirical medicine. Some plague doctors wrote treatises about their experiences and their theories. These texts are fascinating documents, mixing accurate observations with elaborate incorrect theories. They describe symptoms with precision, the timing of fever onset, the location and appearance of buboes, the progression from infection to death. But their explanations invoke astrological conjunctions, corrupt vapors, divine punishment, and imbalances in bodily humours. They were observing reality but interpreting it through a framework that simply couldn't accommodate the actual cause. The equipment and techniques of this period represented the most advanced that medieval medicine could offer against epidemic disease. The protective costume was refined to its maximum effectiveness within the limits of miasma theory. The administrative systems were highly developed. The legal authority was well defined. The resources were substantial. And yet the mortality rates remained catastrophic. The plague doctors couldn't stop the disease. They couldn't save most of their patients. They couldn't protect themselves reliably. What they could do was maintain social order, provide comfort, and bear witness. This period also saw the creation of some of the most haunting images of plague doctors that survive to us. Engravings and paintings from the 17th century show these beaked figures moving through emptied streets, examining the sick, supervising the removal of corpses. Artists captured both the strangeness of the costume and the gravity of the role. These weren't monsters or demons. They were recognizably human figures doing terrible necessary work in the face of incomprehensible catastrophe. Let's pull back the curtain and examine exactly how the plague doctor system functioned on a practical, day-to-day level during a major outbreak. The administrative machinery surrounding these figures was remarkably complex, involving multiple levels of authority, extensive record-keeping, and carefully defined procedures. Understanding this system reveals much about early modern governance and about the social tensions that plagued responses created. The foundation of the system was the health board or magistracy, an administrative body that existed separately from normal civic government. In Italian cities, this was often called the sanità. In France, it might be the Bureau de la Santé. These boards were staffed by appointed officials, typically wealthy merchants or minor nobility, people with administrative experience and social standing, but not necessarily medical knowledge. When reports of plague began to arrive, perhaps from a nearby city, perhaps from a ship in harbour, perhaps from suspicious deaths within the city itself, the health board would activate. This activation involved multiple simultaneous actions. First, they would hire or reactivate contracts with plague doctors. These contracts would specify duration of employment, pay rate, specific responsibilities, and often included bonuses for continued service and penalties for abandoning the position. The health board would also hire dozens or hundreds of other workers depending on city size. Guards to enforce quarantines and prevent people from leaving sealed houses, cleaners to disinfect and whitewash infected buildings, grave diggers to handle the overwhelming number of corpses, clerks to maintain records, and criers to announce new regulations. During the London Plague of 1665, the city employed over 40 searchers of the dead, women who went house to house identifying plague deaths, plus hundreds of guards, nurses, and bearers to remove corpses. The plague doctor sat at the apex of this system as the medical authority. His diagnosis triggered all subsequent actions. When he declared a case to be plague, a cascade of procedures began automatically. The house would be marked, guards would be assigned, the families' names would be recorded, their movements would be restricted or prevented entirely, food provisions would be arranged, legal notifications would be sent to prevent business dealings. If someone in a sealed house died, the plague doctor would be summoned to confirm the death and its cause. Payment systems varied, but were often elaborate. Some plague doctors received a flat salary plus bonuses for each house call or examination. Others received per-case fees. Many contracts included provisions for their families in case of their death, a kind of early life insurance. The amounts were substantial enough that cities sometimes struggled to pay, especially as outbreaks dragged on for months and tax revenues collapsed due to the economic devastation plague caused. The protective equipment was provided by the city, though some plague doctors provided their own. The full costume, mask, overcoat, gloves, boots, hat, cane was expensive, representing a significant investment. Cities maintained stocks of these items, sometimes reusing them between outbreaks or between doctors if one died and needed to be replaced. The aromatics stuffed into the beaked masks were refreshed regularly, and doctors received budgets for purchasing herbs, spices, and other materials needed for their protection and treatments. There were also support systems to keep plague doctors functioning. They received food and wine deliveries so they didn't need to shop in markets or interact with normal commerce. They had designated houses or apartments where they lived during outbreaks, separate from their families when possible. Some cities provided servants to care for their needs, though finding people willing to live with a plague doctor was understandably difficult. The record-keeping was surprisingly sophisticated. Every case, every visit, every death had to be documented. The plague doctor kept daily logs noting symptoms, treatments applied, and outcomes. These logs were submitted to the health board, where clerks compiled citywide statistics. These statistics served multiple purposes. They helped authorities track the spread of the disease, plan for burial needs and quarantine measures, and provide information to other cities about the severity of the outbreak. These records also had legal significance. Plague diagnoses could be challenged in court. If someone disputed that their family member had died of plague, perhaps to claim insurance, avoid quarantine of property, or resolve inheritance disputes, the plague doctor's testimony and records were crucial evidence. This meant documentation had to be detailed and defensible. The relationship between plague doctors and other medical practitioners was complex and often contentious. The regular physicians who hadn't fled generally resented plague doctors, seeing them as inferior practitioners given authority they hadn't earned. The surgeons and apothecaries who actually prepared treatments and dealt directly with patients often had more practical experience but less official authority. During outbreaks, these professional hierarchies could break down or become inverted, creating tensions that lasted beyond the epidemic. There were also fascinating economic dynamics at play. Plague was devastating to city economies. Trade stopped, shops closed, craftsmen died, property values collapsed. But for those employed in plague response, it was a windfall. Plague doctors, guards, grave diggers, and others involved in the system earned more during outbreaks than they ever would in normal times. This created perverse incentives that authorities struggled to manage. Some guards would extort families, demanding bribes to allow food deliveries or to look the other way when someone wanted to leave a sealed house. Some grave diggers stole from the dead before burial. Some plague doctors, as mentioned earlier, took bribes to falsify diagnoses. The system created opportunities for both heroism and exploitation, often within the same individuals. Enforcement was a constant problem. How do you force people to stay in a sealed house when they know it means likely death? Threats of execution or torture, actually. The penalties for breaking quarantine were severe. Hanging, mutilation, or being shot by guards were all documented consequences. Yet people still tried to escape, driven by desperation or hope. Guards would shoot at windows if people tried to pass messages or goods. Entire families would attempt to flee at night, only to be caught and sealed back in with additional penalties. The plague doctor was supposed to stand apart from these enforcement mechanisms, serving as a medical authority rather than an agent of coercion. But in practice, the distinction often blurred. His diagnosis triggered the coercion. His presence meant examination that could lead to imprisonment in one's own home. People learned to fear the beaked figure not because of superstition, but because of what his authority meant for their survival. The most sophisticated deployment of the plague doctor system occurred during the Great Plague of London in 1665, and paradoxically, this represents both the pinnacle of the institution and the beginning of its obsolescence. This outbreak, which killed approximately 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of London's population, saw the plague doctor role at its most developed and most extensively documented. It also saw the limitations of the entire approach become undeniable. London in 1665 was a city of perhaps 460,000 people, the largest metropolis in Britain and one of the largest in Europe. It was also a city of extreme inequality, with wealthy neighbourhoods in the west separated from the crowded, poor parishes of the East End, where plague typically struck first and hardest. The city had experienced plague outbreaks before, notably in 1625 and 1636, so authorities knew what was coming and had developed elaborate response plans. When the plague appeared in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields in late 1664, spreading rapidly through early 1665, the city activated its plague machinery. The Lord Mayor and Aldermen, functioning as the health authority, hired multiple plague doctors and examiners, assigned them to specific districts, and gave them unprecedented powers. At the same time, they published extensive orders detailing exactly how citizens were required to behave during the outbreak. These orders reveal the sophistication of public health thinking at the time, even though it was built on incorrect medical theory. Every house with a plague case had to be sealed for 40 days. Watchmen stood guard day and night to prevent exit. No goods could be sold from infected houses. Bodies had to be buried at night and in designated plague pits, not in churchyards. Dogs and cats, believed to spread the disease, were to be killed on sight. The plague doctors worked within this system, making the critical diagnoses that triggered these draconian measures. We know the names of several London plague doctors from 1665. He describes his daily routine, drinking a preventive draught of wine and wormwood every morning, visiting dozens of patients throughout the day, returning home to smoke tobacco as a preventative, He believed the smoke would purify his insides of corrupt air. And drinking sack, a kind of fortified wine, to exhaustion before sleeping and beginning again the next day. Hodges survived remarkably, and his account gives us invaluable insight into what plague doctors actually believed they were accomplishing. He thought he was saving people. He believed his treatments, bloodletting, purging, poultices, had genuine therapeutic value. He kept careful records of his success rates, noting which treatments seemed to correlate with survival. What he couldn't know was that his survivors would have mostly survived anyway. Bubonic plague has roughly a 50 to 60% mortality rate even without treatment, and many of his treatments actually hasten death in vulnerable patients. Another documented plague doctor was George Thompson, who promoted elaborate chemical treatments derived from the new iatrochemical theories being developed on the continent. These treatments involved compounds of mercury, antimony, and other metals prepared through complex alchemical procedures. They were expensive, dramatic, and completely ineffective, but they represented the cutting edge of medical innovation at the time. The Great Plague of London also produced some of the most detailed contemporary accounts of what it was like to live through a major outbreak. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, though written decades later, drew on extensive research and captured the atmosphere of the city during those months. Samuel Pepys, whose diary provides day-to-day observations, noted seeing plague doctors in the street, marked with their red staffs. London doctors carried staffs rather than canes, and described the fear their presence inspired. What made this outbreak represent the pinnacle of the plague doctor system? Several factors. First, it was the last major plague outbreak to hit a major Western European city. The plague would continue to ravage Eastern Europe and the Middle East for decades longer, but after 1665, the pattern of recurring plague outbreaks in the wealthy cities of the West came to an end. We'll explore why in later sections, but the relevant point here is that 1665 represented the final, most developed implementation of a system that had evolved over 3 centuries. Second, the documentation from the London outbreak is extraordinarily detailed. The bills of mortality, weekly death counts published throughout the outbreak, survive. Parish registers record individual deaths. Personal diaries, official correspondence, and published treatises give us multiple perspectives. We can reconstruct what happened week by week, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, in ways that aren't possible for earlier outbreaks. This documentation reveals both how sophisticated the system had become and how completely it failed to control the disease. Third, the London outbreak occurred at a moment when medical theory was beginning to shift, when some physicians were questioning the old certainties, even as most still clung to them. Hodges himself noted observations that should have challenged miasma theory. He noticed that plague doctors, despite constant exposure to corrupt air, survived at higher rates than sealed families with limited exposure. He couldn't explain this within his theoretical framework, so he attributed it to divine providence or constitutional strength. But the observation was there, a crack in the edifice of established theory. The experience of being a plague doctor in London in 1665 must have been overwhelming. The scale of death was incomprehensible. At the peak of the outbreak in September, over 7,000 people died in a single week in a city of less than 500,000. Streets were empty except for the sick, the dying, and those like plague doctors who had no choice but to be there. The rich had fled to the countryside. King Charles II and his entire court relocated to Oxford. Those who remained were largely the poor, who had nowhere else to go, and the workers keeping the response system functioning. Imagine walking through London in September 1665 as a plague doctor. You make your rounds through parishes where death is everywhere. Houses marked with red crosses line every street. The bills of mortality report thousands dead each week, and you know those numbers are understated because many deaths go unreported. The air reeks of death and desperate attempts to mask it: burning tar, smoking fires, vinegar, and perfumes. You enter a sealed house. Perhaps the father died 3 days ago, and his body is still inside because the bearers haven't come yet. The mother is sick with fever and buboes. 3 children are still healthy but trapped in this charnel house, knowing they'll likely be next. They beg you to release them. You can't. Your diagnosis, plague, has sealed their fate. You examine the mother, lance her buboes, leave instructions for poultices you know won't help, and move to the next house. And the next, and the next. Dozens of houses each day, each one a monument to human suffering and your own inadequacy. This was the pinnacle of the plague doctor's world, a system operating at maximum sophistication and maximum failure simultaneously. The administrative machinery was humming. The authorities had centuries of experience dealing with plague. The medical practitioners had developed elaborate theories and extensive pharmacopoeias. The protective equipment represented the best that contemporary technology could provide. And none of it mattered. The plague raged, the people died, and the system could do little except manage the catastrophe and maintain some semblance of order while death moved through the city like a flood. Even as the plague doctor system reached its most sophisticated form, cracks were appearing in the theoretical foundations that justified it. These weren't obvious breaks. The medical establishment would continue teaching humoral theory and miasma for decades or even centuries after 1665. But careful observers were beginning to notice things that didn't fit. Consider what Nathaniel Hodges noticed during the London Plague. He observed that the disease seemed to spread through personal contact, from sick to healthy, in ways that pure miasma theory couldn't adequately explain. If corrupt air alone caused the disease, why did some people living in the same pestilential atmosphere remain healthy while others fell sick? Why did the disease seem to follow trade routes and travel with people, rather than simply arising spontaneously wherever conditions were unhygienic? Other physicians noticed that plague seemed to be introduced to cities by travellers or trade goods from infected regions, then spread through the local population. This observation had been made for centuries, actually. It's why quarantine systems existed. Ships from infected ports were held in isolation for 40 days before cargo could be unloaded or passengers allowed into the city. But quarantine worked, which suggested that something more specific than general atmospheric corruption was involved. The Italian physician Girolamo Fracastoro had proposed in 1546 that diseases were caused by seeds of contagion, specific particles that could be transmitted from person to person through direct contact, airborne transmission, or contaminated objects. His theory, while still speculative and not based on observation of actual microorganisms, was closer to the truth than miasma theory. But it remained a minority view, not widely accepted by the medical establishment. The bigger crack appeared not in medical theory, but in observed reality. The plague was ending. After 1665, major plague outbreaks in Western Europe simply stopped. There were a few localized incidents, Marseille in 1720 for instance, but nothing like the recurring devastation that had characterized the previous 3 centuries. Eastern Europe continued to experience plague into the 19th century, and plague remained endemic in parts of Asia and Africa. But the great cities of Western Europe were suddenly free of it. Why? Nobody at the time knew for certain, and they proposed various theories. Some credited improved public health measures and quarantine systems. Others thought that the disease itself had somehow changed or weakened. Some saw divine intervention. We now know that multiple factors were probably involved: changes in rat populations and housing construction, that reduced human-rodent contact, quarantine measures that were actually effective despite being based on incorrect theory, and possibly evolutionary changes in the bacterium or flea vectors themselves. But the relevant point for our story is this. The plague doctors had dedicated their careers to fighting a disease based on miasma theory. They wore their protective costumes, used their treatments, enforced their quarantines, all built on a foundation of incorrect medical understanding. And then the disease vanished, not because of their theories or treatments, but due to factors they hadn't identified and didn't understand. This created a crisis of confidence, though not an immediate one. For decades after 1665, European physicians expected plague to return. The entire apparatus was maintained, ready to be activated. Ports continued quarantine procedures. Medical texts continued teaching students how to recognize and treat plague. The protective costumes were stored in civic buildings, waiting for the next outbreak. But as years became decades, and decades approached a century, and no major plague outbreak appeared, questions began to arise. If the great pestilence had been conquered, how? What had actually worked? The answers weren't clear because so many things had changed simultaneously. Better quarantine, cleaner cities, different housing construction, evolving rat populations, shifts in trade patterns. Plague control had succeeded not through understanding, but through a combination of partially effective measures and fortunate circumstances. This uncertainty extended to the plague doctors themselves. By the early 18th century, the position was already becoming anachronistic in Western Europe. There were still plague doctors in Eastern Europe where plague continued, and the position was maintained in name in the West, but the reality was changing. Medical practice was evolving, moving away from the old certainties even as it hadn't yet found new ones. The rise of anatomical study and direct observation was beginning to undermine humoral theory. Physicians trained in the new methods were less confident in bloodletting and purging as universal treatments. The development of microscopy, though still primitive, was revealing a previously invisible world of tiny organisms. The connection between these organisms and disease wouldn't be established for another century and a half, but the seeds were being planted. There was also a growing recognition that many of the plague doctors' treatments had been useless or harmful. Physicians reviewing records noticed that survival rates among plague patients treated with aggressive bloodletting and purging were no better, and possibly worse, than among patients who received minimal intervention. The elaborate poultices and remedies, so confidently prescribed, seemed to make no difference to outcomes. But here's what's interesting. The failure of plague doctor medicine didn't discredit the role itself or the system it was part of. The isolation measures, the record keeping, the systematic response to epidemic disease. These administrative structures had genuine value independent of the underlying medical theory. Even though the medical treatments didn't work, the public health infrastructure did help control disease spread by separating the sick from the healthy, maintaining sanitation to some degree, and preventing panic from completely destabilizing society. This created a peculiar legacy. The plague doctor as a medical figure failed. Their treatments didn't work, their protective equipment was based on false theory, and their authority was built on incorrect understanding. But the plague doctor as an administrative figure succeeded in helping societies respond to catastrophic disease in organized rather than chaotic ways. The role evolved from medical practitioner to public health administrator, even as the medicine remained ineffective. Young physicians in the 18th century found themselves standing with one foot in the old world and one in the new. They still learned humoral theory. They still heard their professors praise Galen and Hippocrates, but they were also walking the long wards of new hospitals, seeing diseases grouped together not by abstract theory, but by the ways they actually behaved in real human bodies. In places like the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, students could see hundreds of patients at a time. They weren't reading about fevers in books. They were touching them, smelling them, listening to chests, watching what happened when a certain remedy was given and when it wasn't. The plague, by contrast, was largely an absence, something talked about, prepared for, feared in theory, but increasingly not seen in practice in Western Europe after the early 1700s. And that absence was quietly corrosive. The whole plague doctor system had been built on an assumption that plague was a recurring, almost inevitable visitation from God or from nature, and that when it came, societies had to activate this special emergency apparatus. At the same time, the wider medical landscape was changing. New theories emerged that competed with humoralism. Iatrochemists saw disease as an imbalance of chemical reactions. Others emphasized the mechanical nature of the body, organs as pumps, vessels as pipes. None of these were fully correct, but each chipped away at the confidence that the old for-humor model was the bedrock of all medical truth. As doubt grew, so did quiet embarrassment. Look again at that beaked mask through an 18th century physician's eyes. In 1650, it was the cutting edge of protective equipment, a rational attempt to filter dangerous air. By 1750, to many younger doctors, it was starting to look like a relic, a theatrical, slightly ridiculous costume from a more frightened age. The idea that carefully chosen herbs in a leather beak could stop a devastating disease no longer sounded like bold science. It sounded uncomfortably close to superstition. But the system didn't vanish overnight. In Eastern and Central Europe, plague continued to appear into the late 18th and even 19th centuries. Cities like Moscow, Vienna, and various Balkan towns still experienced outbreaks. There, plague doctors, or their equivalents, were still hired, still sent into infected districts, still given broad powers. Yet even in these places, the cracks were visible. One of the most telling signs was the growing tension between civic authorities and professional physicians. In earlier centuries, plague doctors had often been marginal figures, desperate young men, second-rate practitioners, or opportunists willing to accept risk for pay. But by the 1700s, professional identity mattered more. Physicians increasingly saw themselves as members of a learned, regulated profession. The idea of being labelled a plague doctor, wearing that old-fashioned costume, doing the grim work of house-to-house inspection, began to feel like a step down rather than an honour. You start to see this in correspondence and memoirs. Some physicians refused plague doctor posts because they feared the position would damage their reputation. Others accepted, but tried to distance themselves from certain practices, arguing against sealing houses, for instance, or questioning the wisdom of lancing every bubo. The old system was still there, but the participants no longer believed in it with the same intensity. The unravelling also had a darker, more human side: fatigue and disillusionment. In regions where plague still appeared, repeated outbreaks took a psychological toll. People had lived for generations under the threat of sudden, massive mortality. They had seen quarantines imposed, houses sealed, bodies dumped into pits, commerce stopped. They had watched plague doctors march in, do their work, and leave, and yet the disease kept returning. How many times can you endure such cycles before your faith in the system erodes? When an outbreak appeared, some people now resisted more openly. They hid their sick relatives, bribed officials, attacked guards. Rumours spread that plague doctors and health boards were using the disease as an excuse to seize property, settle political scores, or test dangerous treatments. Some of those rumours were exaggerated, but not all were baseless. Opportunities for abuse always grow in emergencies, and plague was the ultimate emergency. In the Habsburg lands, during the plague of 1713 in Vienna, and later outbreaks in the Balkans, we find records of riots against health measures, protests against quarantines, against cordons of soldiers surrounding infected towns, against the forcible removal of the sick to pest houses. Plague doctors, as visible instruments of this system, sometimes became targets of popular anger. At the same time, bureaucracies were professionalizing. States like Austria, Prussia, and France were building stronger centralized administrations. Public health began to move out of the purely medical sphere and into the hands of state officials and military planners. Where once a handful of plague doctors and health magistrates had coordinated the response, now larger, more systematic structures took shape. Sanitary cordons along borders, permanent lazarettos at ports, standing regulations for trade and travel. In this expanded machinery, the individual plague doctor mattered less. Increasingly, what controlled disease wasn't the lone physician in a beaked mask, but layered systems of inspection, quarantine, and border control, often overseen by non-medical officials. The classic figure of the plague doctor, with his cane and his mask and his special contract, began to feel like a character from an earlier chapter. Meanwhile, science kept moving, slowly, unevenly, but steadily. The microscope, crude in the 1600s, improved in the 1700s. Tiny organisms, what we'd now call microbes, became visible. No one yet connected them definitively to specific diseases like plague, but the idea that an invisible world might be directly involved in illness was becoming harder to dismiss. All of this, better observation, bureaucratic control, the disappearance of plague in Western Europe, the slow decay of faith in humoral and miasma theories, combined to leave the plague doctor stranded. He was an official without a disease, a specialist whose main enemy had quietly departed the stage. By the late 18th century in Paris or London, if you said plague doctor, people might still know what you meant. They might recall stories their grandparents told or images in old engravings. But the figure no longer walked their streets. He had become already half memory and half warning, a reminder of a time when medicine had been so confident and yet so powerless. And underneath that memory, another realization was starting to grow, one that would become much clearer in the 19th century. If these men, with all their elaborate costumes and confident theories, had been so wrong, what does that say about us now? About the treatments and certainties we cling to today, the plague doctor, without knowing it, had become an uncomfortable mirror. There's rarely a clean line between then and now in history, but with plague doctors, we can get surprisingly close. In Western Europe, the effective breaking point came when two things became undeniable. First, that plague no longer behaved as an inevitable recurring scourge, and second, that medicine itself was undergoing a revolution that made the old frameworks untenable. By the early 19th century, the last major plague outbreak in Western Europe, Marseille in 1720-1722, was already a century in the past. In Central and Eastern Europe, plague still appeared, but even there it was less frequent, less predictable, less central to people's sense of what the future would bring. Cholera, typhus, smallpox, and tuberculosis had become the new great terrors. Each of these new diseases did something subtle but vital. They didn't fit the old plague script. Cholera exploded along trade routes and waterways, then vanished, then returned. Typhus thrived in crowded, filthy conditions, especially among soldiers and prisoners. Tuberculosis crept silently through cities, chronic rather than explosive. The responses they demanded were different. You couldn't just seal houses and burn clothes and expect cholera to go away. It was in the water supply. You couldn't treat TB with a sudden cordon. It lingered for years. The plague doctor's entire world, his tools, his role, his legal powers, had been shaped by a very particular kind of disease, one that moved in dramatic waves, killed quickly, and inspired panic. When the dominant threat started to behave differently, the old solutions stopped making sense. Meanwhile, medicine itself hit its own breaking point. Anatomical studies had already undermined many traditional ideas about how the body worked. Clinical observation had begun to show that diseases had specific patterns and courses, not just vague humoral imbalances. Then, in the mid to late 19th century, came something that would have been unimaginable to a 17th century plague doctor: the germ theory of disease. Figures like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch demonstrated that specific microorganisms caused specific diseases: anthrax, tuberculosis, cholera. They showed that these diseases could be transmitted, cultured, and even prevented. Germ theory didn't just tweak older ideas, it overturned them. Miasma, bad air, wasn't the root cause. Corrupt vapors and planetary alignments weren't the key. Invisible life, reproducing according to its own logic, was. Viewed through germ theory, the plague doctor costume became something startling, a historical artifact of misinterpretation. The beak stuffed with herbs, useless against bacteria spread by fleas on rats or droplets from human lungs. The waxed coat, it might have provided some modest barrier against flea bites or contaminated fluids, but not in the way anyone intended. The cane? Helpful for distance, perhaps, but incidental. The sealing of houses? Sometimes effective, but often just a way of trapping healthy people with the sick. The harshest truth is this: the plague doctor's most confident beliefs about why their tools worked were wrong. If they sometimes helped at all, it was by accident. By the late 19th century, when Alexandra Yersin isolated the plague bacterium in 1894 during an outbreak in Hong Kong, the very disease that had defined the plague doctor's existence was finally understood in microscopic, biological terms. The chain of transmission, rat to flea to human, became clear. New strategies followed: rat control, sanitation, insecticides, and eventually antibiotics. Where was the plague doctor in this new world? Nowhere. His role had no place in this emerging scientific framework. Epidemic response became the domain of public health officers, bacteriologists, epidemiologists, and municipal authorities. They didn't need a single, symbolically costumed figure to walk the streets and diagnose by eye. They needed laboratory tests, reporting networks, standardized procedures. In many ways, the breaking point for plague doctors wasn't a single event, but an accumulation of absences. No more contracts signed in fear at the first rumour of disease. No more masks hanging in the city's health office, waiting. No more families watching a beaked figure step through their door and knowing that everything was about to change. Instead, the beaked mask and waxed coat slowly migrated from storerooms and inventories into attics, curiosity cabinets, and eventually museums. Medical texts stopped mentioning the role except in historical summaries. Young physicians no longer imagined themselves in such gear. They imagined white coats and stethoscopes, microscopes, and laboratories. And yet the emotional logic that had sustained the plague doctor didn't disappear. Society still needed symbols of control in the face of disease. We still look for visible markers of authority, uniforms, badges, protective gear, to reassure ourselves that someone is on the case, that there is structure in the chaos. In that sense, the plague doctor didn't so much die as change his shape. In the 20th century, that shape might be the surgeon in a sterile gown and mask, the public health official at a press conference, the epidemiologist modelling curves and advising governments. Different tools, different theories, but the same fundamental dynamic. Someone steps forward in the face of an invisible, terrifying threat and says, "I understand this better than you do." The breaking point then is double-edged. On one side, it marks the end of an era of profound medical misunderstanding, of treatments that often harmed more than they helped. On the other, it forces us to confront a sobering lesson. It is entirely possible for a whole system, professionals, governments, populations, to be united around confident, carefully structured responses that are, at their core, wrong. And if that was true for them in their time, what might be true for us in ours? When an institution dies, it rarely leaves only absence. It leaves traces, habits, structures, ways of thinking that live on in altered forms. The plague doctor is no exception. Even as the beaked figures vanished from the streets, certain elements of their world remained woven into the fabric of modern life. The most obvious legacy lies in public health administration. The idea that you need dedicated systems to handle epidemics, separate from ordinary government, with special powers and procedures, didn't disappear with the plague. It evolved. Modern health departments, disease surveillance networks, quarantine laws, even international agreements about reporting outbreaks. All of these have some of their roots in the early modern boards of health that once hired plague doctors. The weekly bills of mortality in 17th century London, recording deaths by cause and parish, are ancestors of the COVID dashboards and influenza surveillance reports we've grown used to reading. On a more intimate level, the practice of documenting disease in detail, symptoms, progression, geographic spread, was honed in those centuries of plague. Plague doctors and their colleagues kept meticulous records not because they understood bacteria, but because they sensed that understanding patterns mattered. That instinct survived and strengthened. Another legacy is more subtle, our relationship to protective gear. Think for a moment about what that beaked mask represented emotionally. It was a visible, dramatic barrier between danger and safety. To see someone wearing it meant, here is a person who can go where others cannot. Here is someone who is, at least symbolically, armored against what would kill the rest of us. We still do this. Modern personal protective equipment, respirators, isolation gowns, face shields, serves a real, scientifically grounded function. But it also serves a symbolic one. In times of crisis, we look to people in such gear and feel instinctively that the situation is being handled at a different level. The plague doctor's silhouette haunts every image of a masked physician or a hazmat-suited worker in a disaster zone. Some very practical things remained as well. Quarantine, the idea of separating the exposed from the unexposed, has a medieval name, from the Italian quaranta, 40 days, but a modern life. We still use isolation and quarantine, albeit with more nuanced criteria and better understanding of incubation periods. Travel restrictions, port controls, disinfection protocols, all have long lineages that pass right through the age of the plague doctor. What about the people themselves? Most plague doctors did not become famous. They weren't remembered in monuments. Their names sit quietly in city archives, in the margins of legal records and health board minutes. A handful, like Nostradamus or Nathaniel Hodges, lived on in books. But for the most part, they disappeared into the general mass of the forgotten dead. Yet their experiences, recorded in treatises, letters, and reports, continued to circulate among physicians and administrators. Stories were told of the doctor who stayed when others fled, of the one who drank heavily to blunt the terror, of the one who took bribes and was later disgraced. These stories influenced how later generations thought about professional duty, risk, and ethics. Some attitudes that developed around plague doctors also survived in altered form. The idea that certain medical professionals have special obligations in times of crisis, that they should remain when others leave, accept personal risk, attend to the dying even when cure is impossible, didn't vanish when the beaked mask did. It folded into the broader ethos of medicine. On a cultural level, memories of plague and its doctors lingered long after the diseases themselves faded. In folk stories, songs, and local legends, the doctor in the strange mask became a character. Sometimes a figure of dread, sometimes darkly comic, sometimes tragic. Parents would tell children of the time the death doctor walked these streets, warning them to be grateful for their healthier times. Old people would recall how their grandparents spoke of red crosses on doors and the sound of carts at night. And in some regions, especially in Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean, where plague persisted longer, the profession kept flickering on the margins of living memory well into the 19th century. Knowledge, even flawed knowledge, rarely disappears cleanly. It moves, fragments, recombines. Herbal recipes designed for plague patients were repurposed for other fevers. Ventilation practices developed for pest houses informed later hospital designs. The habit of thoroughly airing rooms, burning contaminated materials, and whitewashing walls persisted as good sense, even when the original rationale, driving out miasma, was abandoned. What was lost? Much, and mercifully so. The blind faith in bloodletting as a near-universal remedy. The cruelly rigid sealing of houses in ways that trapped the healthy with the sick. The willingness to interpret epidemic suffering mainly as divine punishment for collective sin. But some less obvious things faded too. The intense society-wide awareness of mortality that repeated plague had once enforced. When plague struck a city, everyone knew it, felt it, lived inside it. Death was public, visible. The plague doctor, however flawed, was a visible response. As plague left, death, especially from infectious disease, became in some ways more private, more medicalized, moved into hospitals and institutions. Still, the memory of those masked figures never fully washed away. Over time, history tends to turn real people into symbols. Few figures illustrate this better than the plague doctor. By the 19th and 20th centuries, when plague was no longer a regular visitor to European cities, the beaked mask had shifted from practical equipment to powerful icon. Painters, illustrators, and later filmmakers rediscovered the image and realized how uncanny it was. Human and yet not. Medical and yet terrifying. In the Romantic era, artists fascinated with death, nightmare, and the Middle Ages seized on plague scenes. Engravings showed long black-clad figures moving among the dead, sometimes more like spirits than men. Plague doctors became shorthand for a certain kind of doom, not sudden violence, but slow, creeping, inescapable horror. Writers used them too. In Gothic tales and historical novels, the plague doctor could serve as a mysterious figure in the background, a witness to catastrophe, a carrier of secrets, an omen. Very rarely were they portrayed as what they mostly were in life: tired, anxious, often overwhelmed municipal employees. Then, in the 20th century, something else happened. The plague doctor became a costume. Carnival in Venice, revived and repackaged for tourists, needed striking, historical-looking figures. Someone reached back into the city's own history and pulled out that unforgettable silhouette. Long coat, wide hat, hooked beak. The medico della peste, the plague doctor, became one of the standard Venetian mask types, alongside Harlequin and the Bauta. There's a deep irony here. An outfit once worn in desperate earnest, meant to protect against invisible death, became a playful disguise for parties. The fearsome beak turned into an elegant curve of lacquered papier-mâché. The herbs and spices that had once been packed into that space were replaced with nothing but breath and laughter. From there, the image spread wider into popular culture. Horror films, video games, novels, artwork. The plague doctor became a favorite motif for those exploring themes of death, disease, secrecy, or dark history. Often, he was given new powers. Alchemist, necromancer, bringer of curses, roles closer to sorcery than to medicine. At the same time, historians were quietly working in the background, dismantling some of these myths and reconstructing the mundane truth. Scholars dug into city archives and found contracts, health board minutes, parish records. They reconstructed the day-to-day duties of plague doctors, the details of their pay, the arguments they had with officials, the practical hardships they faced. They noticed that the beaked mask, often assumed to be universal, appears clearly mainly in 17th century France and Italy, and that many physicians elsewhere dressed more simply. Modern historiography has painted a more nuanced picture. Plague doctors were not a single coherent order, but a patchwork of local arrangements. Some were competent, others incompetent. Some were selfless, others corrupt. Some believed fervently in what they did. Others drank or prayed or wrote bitter letters, suspected deep down that very little they tried actually worked. Yet in the popular imagination, the complexity tends to flatten. The icon remains: the beak, the coat, the cane. What then is the legacy? On one level, the plague doctor is now part of a visual vocabulary we use to talk about pandemic fear. During the COVID-19 pandemic, images of plague doctors circulated widely online, sometimes as jokes, sometimes as grim commentary. People instinctively reached back centuries to find a symbol that felt right for what they were living through. A strange masked figure standing between ordinary life and invisible threat. On another level, the legacy lies in how we think about expertise and failure. The story of plague doctors is often repeated as a cautionary tale about how wrong experts can be. Here were educated men, operating with the best knowledge of their time, their entire world aligned behind humoral and miasma theories, and yet they were fundamentally mistaken about what caused plague and how to prevent it. That can be used superficially to dismiss science altogether. But if we look more closely, a subtler lesson appears. For all their wrongness, plague doctors and their systems did some things right. They recognized the importance of separating the sick from the healthy. They tracked disease patterns. They accepted personal risk to attend to the dying. They helped keep societies from collapsing completely under the weight of terror. Modern medicine is incomparably more accurate in its understanding of disease, but it, too, operates in a mix of knowledge and uncertainty. The plague doctor's legacy, seen clearly, can help us be humble about our own moment, to value expertise without worshipping it, to recognize that even well-intentioned, educated responses can be partly right and partly wrong. And finally, there is a more intimate legacy, harder to quantify, the persistence of memory. In cities that once knew plague deeply, Venice, London, Marseille, Florence, there are still corners where the past feels strangely close. A small museum display with a beaked mask, a plaque marking an old plague pit, a faded painting of Saint Roche, patron against the plague. The plague doctor lives in those spaces as a kind of ghost of civic memory, asking quiet questions about what it means to live under the shadow of mass death and what it means to keep going anyway. The figure you and I picture when we say plague doctor is not simply a product of the 17th century. It's also a creation of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, shaped by what later generations chose to see and what they chose to ignore. Modern rediscovery of plague doctors happened in stages. First came the antiquarians and early historians, combing through archives in the 18th and 19th centuries. They weren't necessarily interested in the costume. They wanted numbers, chronology, causes. They studied mortality bills, parish registers, city ordinances. The physical remnants began turning up as curiosities: masks preserved in old town halls or hospitals, waxed coats and hats in dusty storerooms, woodcuts and engravings in bound volumes of 17th century pamphlets. Museums started collecting these objects: medical museums, city museums, sometimes even art museums. At first, they were presented soberly, as artifacts of past medical practice, alongside bloodletting instruments or surgical saws. But the visual power of the plague doctor image made it stand out. Visitors remembered it, artists sketched it, illustrators used it in books about the Middle Ages and the Black Death. The beak, in particular, fascinated people. It looked so strange, so alien, that it practically demanded an explanation. Historians faced a challenge. Sources about the plague doctor costume itself are surprisingly limited. We have Delorme's description, some city records about equipment, scattered mentions in diaries. Much of what we know about the layout of the herbs in the beak, or the exact form of the mask, has been reconstructed from a mix of textual fragments and artistic depictions, which are themselves stylized. This has opened room for debate. How widely was the full beaked costume really used? Was it confined mostly to certain parts of France and Italy? Did doctors elsewhere rely more on simple masks, cloaks and caps? Scholars argue over details, but popular culture doesn't wait for footnotes. Once the figure of the beaked doctor crystallized in the public mind, it spread rapidly, in comics, on posters, as tattoos, in street art. Modern interpreters tend to project contemporary concerns back onto the plague doctor. Some see him as a symbol of state power in crisis, an agent of coercion who sealed houses, enforced quarantines, and turned private homes into prisons. Others see him as a tragic professional, doing his best with bad tools, crushed between suffering patients and demanding officials. Still others spin him into something almost mythical, a personification of the plague itself, or of death in a bird mask walking the streets. Academically, the interpretation has become more complex and sympathetic over time. Early narratives often painted medieval and early modern medicine as little more than superstition and cruelty, with the plague doctor as Exhibit A. More recent work has tried to place these figures in context. Given what they knew and what they saw and what they had, their actions become more understandable, if still profoundly limited. Archaeology has contributed too. Excavations of old plague pits reveal the hurried, mass nature of burials. Sometimes artifacts appear: rosary beads, nails from coffins, scraps of clothing. Very occasionally, a medical tool or container. These physical traces help confirm the scale of what plague doctors witnessed daily. Not abstract numbers, but bodies upon bodies, layer after layer. DNA analysis of remains from plague pits has confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium. It has allowed scientists to trace the evolution of different plague strains over centuries, showing how the same organism caused waves of mortality at different times. This, in turn, has sharpened our sense of just how blind plague doctors were to the reality underlying what they saw. Modern pandemics have also reshaped interpretation. When HIV/AIDS emerged in the 1980s, historians and writers began drawing parallels between how societies responded to that crisis and to earlier plagues. Stigma, panic, denial, the slow building of public health responses. During COVID-19, the comparison became even more explicit. Quarantine, travel bans, mask debates. Suddenly, the world that produced plague doctors didn't feel quite so distant. What we still debate today touches on deeper questions. To what extent did plague doctors help, harm, or simply bear witness? Were they primarily instruments of social control or of attempted care? Should we remember them mainly as examples of failed science or as early stumbling steps toward public health? There are no simple answers. Our interpretations say as much about us as about them. When we emphasize their error, we reassure ourselves that we live in a more enlightened age. When we emphasize their courage, we align them with modern healthcare workers in Ebola wards or COVID ICUs. When we emphasize their role in coercion, we reflect our anxieties about state power in emergencies. In museum displays and popular books, the plague doctor often stands alone, frozen behind glass. But in reality, he was always embedded in a dense web of fear, politics, theology, class, and evolving knowledge. Rediscovering him in full means not just staring at the mask, but listening for the sounds around it. The whispered prayers, the arguments at the city council, the scratching of quills over plague bills, the hollow cough of someone on the other side of a wooden door waiting to hear the verdict that might seal their fate. Beneath the details of herbs and beaks and contracts, the story of plague doctors touches something very old and very human: how we respond when the world becomes suddenly hostile and incomprehensible. One universal theme is the hunger for control in chaos. When a disease like plague appears, killing quickly, without apparent pattern, it assaults more than bodies. It attacks meaning. People ask, why this person and not that one? Why this house, this street, this city? Religious frameworks answer with sin and punishment. Medical frameworks answer with humours and miasmas. Today we answer with viruses and vectors. But the emotional function is similar. We reach for an explanation that lets us feel we can do something. The plague doctor, in his strange armour, embodied that impulse. He was a walking answer. There is a way to face this. There is a method. Whether or not that was true in practice mattered less, at least in the moment, than the reassurance given. We see versions of this in many civilizations. In ancient Athens, during the plague of the Peloponnesian War, physicians rushed in and died in large numbers, and Thucydides wrote of the breakdown of social norms. In medieval Islamic cities, scholars debated whether fleeing plague was permissible or whether it showed lack of trust in God. In early modern Europe, plague doctors walked the line between flight and fatalism, attempting a third path: organized professional intervention. Another theme is the double-edged nature of expertise. Plague doctors were appointed because they knew more than others, or at least they had training others lacked. But their knowledge was woven from threads of insight and error. They could describe the course of illness precisely, yet explain it wrongly. They could design sophisticated systems of response, yet base them on false assumptions. This pattern repeats. In modern times, experts have helped eradicate smallpox, control many diseases, and extend life dramatically. Yet experts have also promoted harmful treatments, from bloodletting in the 1800s to certain discredited psychiatric or public health practices in the 20th century. The plague doctor's story warns us that expertise is essential but never infallible. A third theme is the tension between care and control. Plague doctors occupied a strange intersection, part healer, part bureaucrat, part enforcer. Their diagnosis could bring help, but also confinement, loss of livelihood, social death before physical death. People called them in hoping for relief, and dreaded what they might say. We still wrestle with this. Public health measures often blur the line between protecting individuals and restricting them. Quarantines, mandatory treatments, lockdowns, these can save lives, but they also limit freedoms. The questions cities asked in 1600, how far can we go to stop disease? Who gets to decide? Are not so different from what we ask in outbreaks today. There's also a quieter, more personal pattern, what it means to keep working inside disaster. Imagine the inner life of a plague doctor who realized on some level that his specific treatments rarely helped. Perhaps he still believed in his role broadly, keeping order, giving comfort, recording events, but felt a creeping sense of futility about his medical tools. Does he double down, insisting more fiercely that bloodletting works? Does he become cynical, going through the motions for pay? Does he shift quietly, focusing on being present, listening, copying down last wills? In any overwhelming crisis, war, famine, pandemic, there are people in such positions, at once necessary and inadequate, committed and exhausted. Studying plague doctors can deepen our empathy for these roles in our own time. Another important pattern is how myths grow around fear. The real plague doctor, as we've seen, was complicated, a municipal employee with a flawed theory and a difficult job. But in memory, he becomes something tidier, the sinister birdman, the dark healer, the embodiment of pestilence. This simplification makes it easier to talk about plague, to draw it in a single image. We do this often. Complex histories shrink into icons. The cowboy, the samurai, the knight, the pirate, each far messier in reality than in myth. The plague doctor joins that gallery, but with a twist. He is an icon of ignorance and good faith at the same time. Finally, the story points toward our enduring vulnerability. We like to think that with enough science, enough planning, enough technology, we can conquer uncertainty, and we have made staggering progress compared to the age of plague. Yet new diseases still emerge. Old ones evolve. Systems crack under pressure. During COVID-19, countries with advanced health systems still struggled. Mistakes were made, lives lost, debates raged. Looking back at plague doctors is not an exercise in mockery, but in perspective. They did the best they could with what they had, and that best was not nearly good enough. We too are doing our best with what we have. Future generations will likely see our blind spots more clearly than we can. The wisdom here is not despair, but humility. We learn from their errors and keep building. We retain their instincts to organize, to document, to care, while discarding their flawed theories. We remember that beneath every system are real human beings taking risks, making choices, sometimes getting it right, often falling short. And we acknowledge that memory itself, our stories about the past, is always a blend of fact and meaning. The plague doctor exists now, partly as he was, and partly as we need him to be. A warning, a curiosity, a symbol of both how wrong and how earnest humans can be when faced with fear. If you close your eyes for a moment, I'd like you to return with me to that quiet street we visited at the beginning. It's evening again in some European city centuries ago. The air is heavy, not just with the smells of wood smoke and refuse, but with something else. The weight of fear pressing down on every shuttered window. Behind many of those windows, someone is coughing. Someone is burning with fever. Someone is listening for footsteps outside, dreading the knock that might come. Down the street, the tall black figure appears. The hat, the coat, the cane tapping softly on the stones. The mask, its glass eyes faintly catching the dim light, its beak pointing forward like an accusation, or perhaps like a question. Inside the mask, a man's breath, tinged with herbs and sweat, and maybe the sourness of too little sleep and too much wine. He stops at a door marked with a red cross. Inside, a family waits. Maybe they're praying. Maybe they're bargaining with a god they're not sure they believe in anymore. Maybe they're numb. The plague doctor raises his cane, knocks, and steps in. For them, in that moment, he is everything. Hope, dread, judgment, medicine, law. From where we sit now, miles and centuries away, in rooms with electric light and clean water and antibiotics waiting in cabinets, that scene feels both impossibly distant and strangely close. We know more than they did. We can name the bacterium that haunted their streets, trace its genes, see it under a microscope. We can treat it with drugs they could not imagine. We can explain why their masks didn't work, why their treatments failed, why their quarantines sometimes help despite being based on the wrong theory. And yet some things in that room are unchanging. The way a mother watches the face of anyone who might help her child. The exhaustion in the shoulders of someone who has seen too many bodies. The fragile, stubborn hope that maybe, somehow, this case will be different. As we close this story, what stays with me most is not the costume, striking as it is. It's the collision of sincerity and error inside that mask. These men woke up each day and walked into danger, often fully aware that their chances of surviving an outbreak were not great. Many accepted the job for money, or because they had few other options. Few were saints, but most, I suspect, did not want their patients to die. They worked, they recorded, they prescribed, often with an aching sense that the tools in their hands were too light against the weight of what they faced. The harsh truth about medieval and early modern plague doctors is that they were both necessary and ineffective, both brave and misguided. They mattered enormously to the societies that hired them, and yet they had almost no power to change the course of the disease that defined their role. And still, they left marks. In our health systems, in our ideas about duty and risk, in our symbols of masks and medicine, in the half-remembered stories that surface whenever a new outbreak makes the world feel fragile again. As you sit here now, perhaps with the sounds of your own evening around you, traffic in the distance, a fan humming, someone in another room scrolling on their phone, there's a quiet connection across time. Those people, in their dark streets, also sat and listened, to carts, to bells, to distant footsteps that might mean news. We remember them not only to shudder at how bad things once were, but to reflect on what we carry forward. We carry better knowledge, and the responsibility that comes with it. We carry institutions that can help or harm depending how we shape them. We carry stories of masks, of doctors, of past mistakes that can make us more cautious, more compassionate, more aware of how easily certainty can become illusion. History rarely gives us neat morals, but it does offer gentle guidance. Be wary of absolute confidence. Value those who walk toward danger to care for others, even when their tools are imperfect. Question systems that sacrifice the vulnerable too easily in the name of safety. And remember that every time we tell these stories, we choose what to emphasize: monsters, heroes, or more often, complicated human beings in over their heads. The plague doctor, in the end, is not just a figure from a distant, frightening past. He is a reminder that in every age, including ours, people stand at the edge of what is known, trying to do the right thing with incomplete understanding. As you drift toward the rest of your night, perhaps laying down, turning off lights, letting your mind soften, I invite you to hold that image gently. A lonely figure in a dark street, mask hiding his face, cane in hand, pausing. before another door. Not a villain, not a savior, just a person called to step into a room full of fear, bringing what little he has to offer. Thank you for walking through this history with me, slowly, patiently. If you find yourself thinking about that beaked mask again in the days ahead, I hope it carries not just horror, but a quiet sense of kinship and a reminder of how far we've come and how carefully we should use the knowledge we now hold. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are. And if you'd like to wander through another piece of the past together next time, I'll be right here, waiting.